War-Torn by Vroom. 4 men wandered the jungles of Vietnam, all armed with M16 rifles. The group of men were of Australian origin and were very proud to serve their country, even more proud of their mission to bring peace to Vietnam. Although armed with M16s, the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, were resolved to only use them as a last resort. The 3rd Battalion were to merely patrol and search villages, without destroying them, and to attempt to convert the villages through peaceful means. This band of 4 comprised of 22-year-old Private Hayden Edwards, who was quite the stout but well-groomed fellow with a thick Australian accent, 19-year-old Private Finn Lucas, who was tall, thin and wiry, with an ever-present 5 o'clock shadow, 21-year-old Corporal Frank Dillon, who was of average stature and typically level-headed, quiet and reserved. Last but not least was 25-year-old Sergeant Bailey McElroy, was humble and could be mistaken for a bodybuilder due to how fit he was. The band of brothers walked single file with Sergeant Bailey McElroy leading the group. The trees creaked eerily as the group walked, and Finn felt as if they were being watched, which made him nervous.
"Is this the last village before we head back to camp and meet up with the rest of the 3rd Battalion, Sarge? Because I'm getting hungry,"
Finn Lucas said in a hushed voice, trying to calm himself. Bailey McElroy opened his mouth to reply, but shut it when Hayden Edwards spoke first.
"Same here, Finn. I don't understand why we don't just bomb the Northerners with chemicals. It'd save us a whole lot of fighting, and we'd be at home eating right now."
Bailey shook his head as he trudged on through the woods, which were becoming more and more scarce as he advanced.
"It's enough. Wait, didn't there used to be foliage here?"
Sure enough, the area ahead of them was bare.
"Yeah, it definitely was,"
replied Frank Dillon. A feeling of unease took Finn as his mind tried to provide a solution for what could have destroyed the foliage.
"Surely the Yanks didn't use..."
Frank began, but paused out of shock when he saw the village. A dozen bodies of various ages, sizes and sacks lied on the ground. All the bodies were bald, red and blistered. It was as if the fires of hell had swept through the village itself. Arguably, they had.
"Agent Orange,"
Bailey stated with contempt in his voice. He unknowingly finished the sentence that Frank had started. Finn's stomach turned and the contents of his last meal were at stake. As they tried to exit his mouth, he managed to fight it back down.
"Oh God, we're being exposed to this stuff. Are we going to end up like them?"
Finn managed with a shaky voice. Bailey shook his head.
"No, not unless the Americans use more. Going to split into 2 groups and search for survivors. Finn, I want you with Frank. Hayden, follow me."
Finn and Frank happened upon a small and ominous shack. Finn wasn't sure why, but he had the distinct feeling that something alive lurked inside. Finn slowly pushed open the door and cautiously stuck his head inside, hoping that whatever was present wasn't sinister and didn't take his head off. A bald, red, blistered woman was lying on a bed. She was nude and alone. She was giving birth.
"Oh God. Go get Sarge,"
Finn managed to Frank. Frank bolted out of the humble little shack, calling out for Edwards and McElroy. Hayden and Bailey peeked out of the shack they had just searched. They ran to Frank after they saw the coast was clear.
"Where's Finn?"
Bailey asked in a panicked tone.
"He's fine, Sergeant. Finn's with a survivor. She's giving birth,"
Frank replied with a combination of worry and excitement ebbing from his voice.
"Oh, God help me, I'm only 19.
Finn muttered to himself as he coached the crowning woman.
"Push! Come on! Push!"
A head and shoulders popped out. The skin was normal and not red or blistered as Finn had feared it would be. Finn gently grabbed the shoulders and began to pull out. The door to the shack opened and Frank, Bailey and Hayden entered just in time to see the rest of the baby come out. The torso slid right on out, followed by another set of shoulders and a head. Finn tearfully and carefully handed the fused deceased baby to its mother. Both tears and hatred filled the woman's eyes as she looked up at Finn. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but the words never came. Finn reached down with his hands trembling and closed the dead woman's eyes. Although the woman hadn't spoke, Finn knew that she had blamed him and the company he kept for the Agent Orange. This did not sit well with Finn, who let the tears flow forth from his eyes. The four men stood there, giving the deceased a moment of respectful silence. Bailey eventually broke the silence when he turned to Hayden.
This is why we don't bomb anyone until they surrender.
Hayden nodded in understanding as he wiped away a couple of tears. Rain fell from the sky as the men exited the shack. It was as if the sky itself was weeping too. The group hurried back towards the camp in hopes of getting out of the rain and receiving hot meals. Those hopes were dashed for Sergeant Bailey McElroy when he was struck down by a loud but unseen assailant. A bullet. The bullet entered and exited through Bailey's neck. An ambush that consisted of 7 well-armed North Vietnamese had made it behind the Australians. Unbeknownst to the band that was once 4, but now 3, the Vietnamese had seen them leaving the village and had assumed they were responsible for its destruction by Agent Orange.
Bailey!
Finn exclaimed in a panic as he saw his comrade hit the ground with blood spurting from his neck.
There's nothing we could do for him, Finn. We need to hightail it back to the camp or we're going to get slaughtered.
Frank shouted over the gunfire. The 3 raced for the camp and their lives. Edwards had a considerable lead, followed by Lucas and Dylan. The men hadn't made it far from where Bailey had died when Frank Dillon's right foot landed on a mine. The landmine exploded, tearing through and incinerating Frank's right leg as it spat shrapnel in all directions. Shrapnel from the landmine struck Finn square in the back, causing him to fall to the ground in pain. Hayden turned around upon hearing the explosion and saw his comrade's predicament. Finn picked himself up off the ground, trying to ignore the pain and pieces of shrapnel in his back. As he advanced to Frank, was firing his M16 wildly. Hayden followed Finn's example and doubled back towards Frank, was firing his M16 at the North Vietnamese as well. 2 of the Vietnamese were hit by the random spray of bullets, which caused the rest of them to back off and seek cover. Finn and Hayden took advantage of the ceasefire and helped Frank back to his leg.
Frank, can you use your gun as a crutch?
Hayden asked. Frank's response was nothing more than a series of pained wails.
Don't be daft, Hayden. It's going to bleed out if we don't get him back to camp quick.
Finn replied. Hayden reached into his left pant pocket and pulled out a handkerchief.
Hayden, it's not going to work.
It's better than nothing. Ought to slow it down.
Hayden quickly wrapped the handkerchief around Frank's stump and tied it off. No sooner had Hayden finished when the firing resumed. Finn dropped his M16 in favor of Frank and slung him over his shoulder as he began to travel back to the camp as fast as he possibly could, while Hayden laid down more oppressive fire. Every step was grueling for Finn. Every step felt as if it could be his last. Finn, Hayden, and Frank's struggle bore fruit as the camp came into view. The fruit became forbiddance for Finn as a bullet struck him in the head, causing him to collapse and drop Frank. Darkness approached, and despite Finn's best efforts to fight it off, he blacked out.
And that's how I lost my ear and got discharged, Doc.
The thin, bald, glasses-wearing therapist nodded and cupped his chin as the 64-year-old veteran of Vietnam, Finn Lucas, finished his tale. The therapist, Troy Lawton, had a long history of providing a listening ear for war veterans. "Did Frank survive?" inquired Troy. Finn scratched his patchy white beard in thought.
It's hard to say, Doc. I mean, he didn't bleed out and he got discharged. But he's a completely different man. He spent most of his time since Vietnam kicking back tinnies. I'd argue that the Frank Dillon I knew died the moment he kicked that landmine. But then, I'd say that no one that participated in Vietnam survived. We all suffered, unless one thing or another, sometimes multiple.
What about Private Edwards? Finn shook his head.
I've no idea. When I was blacked out, the rest of the 3rd Battalion came out of the camp due to having heard the commotion and repelled the Vietnamese away. During that period of time, Hayden got head and dragged off. Whether that bullet killed him, he lives, or was tortured and freed or executed, I do not know. Hayden was never found and is MIA to this very day.
The two men sat in silence for a couple of moments as Troy Lawton digested what he had been told. The only sound that could be heard was the ticking of the grandfather clock. "Have your sleeping habits improved?" Troy finally asked, breaking the silence.
No, I still don't get much, maybe 4 hours. I hear M16s without fail when I shut my eyes. Rainy nights are particularly bad, but the thunder is the worst. I take that back. News choppers. Any choppers are. Every time I hear a chopper, I automatically flinch and start to lift my M16, only to realise that it isn't there.
You aren't alone in that, Finn.
Many who come back from deployment experience feelings similar to yours. Tell me, do you feel any hatred towards the Americans for using Agent Orange? Hatred? No. I was very angry at their military for the longest period of time. Years. I eventually came to realise that they weren't the monsters I tried to make them out to be. Rather, they're just people who made a poor decision. Granted, that particular poor decision had consequences far more serious than most poor decisions.
An alarm went off, signalling the therapy session was over. "Oh, looks like our time's already up. Will I be seeing you again, Mr. Lucas? I know you've had trouble finding a therapist you found satisfactory over the years, but..."
"Yeah, Doc. I'll give you a few more sessions to see if you can heal me."
Finn cut him off as he lifted himself out of the seat. Finn made his way across the room, put his hand on the doorknob and paused. "Something wrong, Finn?"
That incident with Agent Orange was 45 years ago. And that just got me thinking. What sort of weapons must exist now?
Finn opened the door and walked out.